The silence in Arthur Penhaligon's house didn't just sit in the rooms, it had weight. It was a heavy, grey thing that had moved in shortly after his wife, Martha, had passed away 3 years ago. At 74, Arthur found that his life had become a series of quiet rituals designed to kill time before time eventually killed him. He woke at 6 a.m., not because he had anywhere to be, but because his internal clock was still set to the rhythm of a high school history teacher who hadn't missed a day of work in 42 years. He made 1 piece of dry toast, drank 1 cup of black coffee, and stared at the walls of his study, which were lined from floor to ceiling with the only friends he had left, his books. Arthur was a man of paper and ink in a world of glass and light. He didn't understand the cloud, he didn't trust algorithms, and he found the constant glow of smartphones in the hands of the youth to be a sign of a decaying civilization. To Arthur, if a fact wasn't written on a page that you could smell and feel, it was a ghost, unreliable and fleeting. By 10 a.m., the weight of the house would become too much. He would put on his tweed coat, the elbows worn thin from decades of leaning on lecterns, and walk 3 blocks to the Oak Ridge Community Center. The center was a brick building that smelled of floor wax and overboiled cabbage. For the last 2 years, it had been Arthur's sanctuary. He didn't participate in the silver sneakers aerobics or the bingo nights. Instead, he volunteered in the basement, in a room labeled the Literacy and Heritage Annex. There, he helped neighborhood kids with their homework and showed them how to use a card catalog, even though most of them just stared at him like he was explaining how to flint a spearhead. Among those kids was Leo. Leo was 15, wore a hoodie like a suit of armor, and possessed a scowl that could stop a clock. He was at risk, according to the social workers. To Arthur, he was just a boy who was bored because no one had ever told him a story worth hearing. "Why you got all these old papers, Mr. P?" Leo asked one afternoon, pointing to a stack of 1940s neighborhood newspapers Arthur was archiving. "Everything is online, man. My phone knows more than this whole room." Arthur looked up over his spectacles. "Your phone knows data, Leo. It doesn't know truth. Data tells you the data building was built. Truth tells you why the people who built it were singing while they laid the bricks. Data is a skeleton. Truth is the soul." Leo rolled his eyes, but he didn't leave. He stayed for an hour, watching Arthur's gnarled fingers carefully turn the yellowed pages. But the fog wasn't just in Arthur's house, it was creeping into the city budget. On a Tuesday that felt like any other, Arthur arrived at the center to find the basement door locked. Through the glass, he saw the director, a harried woman named Sarah, standing over several large cardboard boxes. "Sarah! The door is stuck," Arthur called out, rattling the handle. Sarah walked over and opened the door just a crack. Her eyes were red. "I'm sorry, Arthur. The city council vote came through last night. They're defunding the annex. Actually, they're closing the whole youth wing." Arthur felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. Closing it? Where will the kids go? Where will Leo go? "They're calling it urban reprioritization," Sarah said, her voice dripping with bitterness. "They're putting the money into the new downtown tech corridor. They said physical libraries and history programs are low-yield assets. They're giving the kids vouchers for digital learning platforms." Digital platforms. Arthur's voice rose, a rare occurrence. You can't feed a hungry mind with a voucher for a website. These kids come here for the heat, for the safety, for the books. "I know, Arthur. But the boxes are here. We have 48 hours to clear the room. Anything not out by Thursday goes to the city incinerator." Arthur watched as Sarah walked away, leaving him standing in the hallway of a world that had decided he, and everything he loved, was a low-yield asset. He spent the next 2 days in a blur of quiet fury. He watched as the maps he had donated were tossed into bins. He watched as the 1920s blueprints of the city, hand-drawn masterpieces of ink and hope, were treated like trash. On Thursday afternoon, he saw Leo standing on the sidewalk outside the center. The boy looked smaller somehow. He wasn't scowling, he just looked vacant. He was staring at the "facility closed" sign taped to the door. "Where we gonna go, Mr. P?" Leo asked. "The cops don't want us in the park. The mall kicks us out if we don't buy nothing." This was the only place that didn't feel like a waiting room for jail. Arthur looked at the boy, then at the boxes of books being loaded onto a truck bound for the dump. He looked at his own hands, the hands of a teacher. "Go home, Leo," Arthur said quietly. "And tell the others. If they want to read, if they want to know the truth, tell them to find the house with the red mailbox on 4th Street. Arthur went home and did something he hadn't done in years. He opened his garage. It was a cavern of neglected memories. Old lawnmowers, Martha's gardening tools, boxes of Christmas decorations that hadn't seen the light of day since she died. He spent the next 6 hours hauling heavy bags to the curb. His back throbbed. His knees popped with the sound of dry twigs. At one point, he had to sit on an old milk crate for 20 minutes just to catch his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You're an old fool, Arthur," he thought. "You're a tired, obsolete old fool." But then he remembered the look on Leo's face. He remembered the smell of the city incinerator. He began to move his library. One by one, he carried his precious volumes from the safety of his climate-controlled study to the cold, concrete garage. He built shelves out of old scrap lumber and cinderblocks. He found an old rug to cover the oil stains on the floor. He brought out his favorite leather armchair and a small, flickering space heater that groaned when it turned on. By 3 a.m., the garage was transformed. It wasn't a room anymore. It was a fortress. Thousands of spines lined the walls: Plato, Churchill, Morrison, Baldwin. In the center, on a heavy oak table, he laid out the blueprints he had liberated from the community center's trash bins. He went to his kitchen, found a can of white paint, and a piece of plywood. With a shaking hand, he painted 4 words. He nailed the sign to the garage door and sat down in his rocking chair. He left the big garage door open just a few inches, a sliver of warm light spilling out onto the dark, cold pavement of 4th Street. He waited. The sun rose. The neighborhood woke up. Cars drove by. A dog barked. Arthur fell into a light, fitful sleep in his chair, his chin resting on his chest. He was woken by a sound. A metallic clink. He opened his eyes. The garage door was being pushed up. There, standing in the morning mist, was Leo. Behind him stood 2 other boys and a girl Arthur recognized from the annex. They looked at the walls of books, then at the old man in the rocking chair. "Is this for real, Mr. P?" Leo asked, his voice a whisper. "You really brought all this here?" Arthur stood up, his bones complaining, but his spirit standing taller than it had in years. He walked to the table and smoothed out the 1920 blueprint of their neighborhood. "Welcome to the Midnight Library, Leo," Arthur said. "Pick a book. Any book. We have work to do." But as the kid stepped into the warmth, Arthur noticed a black sedan idling at the end of the block. A man in a sharp grey suit was taking a photo of Arthur's house with a smartphone. Arthur didn't know it yet, but the Goliath of the city's development board had already noticed the little red mailbox on 4th Street. And they didn't like people who kept the past alive. By the second week, the Midnight Library had developed its own ecosystem. The smell of old paper and dust had been replaced by the scent of peppermint tea and the damp, earthy smell of rain-soaked hoodies drying near the space heater. Arthur's garage was no longer just a room, it was a sanctuary of the unplugged. He had instituted a strict rule: phones in the basket by the door. At first, the teenagers had looked at the wicker basket as if it were a guillotine. But slowly, they realized that without the constant buzz in their pockets, the silence of the library was actually a form of peace. "Why do you care so much about this old dirt, Mr. P?" Leo asked one night. He was sprawled on the rug, a heavy volume of 19th century census records open before him. "The city's changing. My mom says the new tech buildings are progress. She says our neighborhood is just real estate now." Arthur leaned forward in his rocking chair, the wood creaking like an old ship. "Progress, Leo, is a word people use when they want to build something over your head without asking for your permission. Real estate is what you sell. Home is what you remember." He tapped the 1920 blueprint on the table. "You see this park here? Miller's Green. The developers are calling it underutilized land. They want to put 6 stories of concrete over it. But look closer at the handwriting on this deed. It was signed by a woman named Clara Miller in 1892. She didn't just give the land. She gave it with a condition. A restrictive covenant. The kids huddled around. This was detective history. Arthur wasn't just teaching them dates, he was teaching them how to find the cracks in the armor of the powerful. "What's a covenant?" asked Maya, a quiet girl who had spent the last 3 nights meticulously cleaning the covers of Arthur's encyclopedia set. "It's a promise," Arthur said. "A legal promise that lives forever, unless someone is brave enough to find it and read it out loud." Clara Miller lost her own son to the fever that year. She gave this land so that no child in this ward would ever be without a place to see the sky. If we find the original deed, the one that hasn't been digitized or summarized by the city, we might find the words that stop the bulldozers. But as the library grew, so did the shadow at the end of the block. The man in the grey suit returned, but this time he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a city building inspector named Henderson, a man whose soul seemed to be made of clipboards and red tape. They stood at the edge of Arthur's driveway, looking at the hand-painted sign and the group of teenagers inside. "Mr. Penhaligon." Henderson called out, his voice sharp and cold. Arthur stood up, his knees popping. He met them at the threshold of the garage. "Can I help you, gentlemen? We're right in the middle of a study session." "You're running a business in a residential zone," Henderson said, tapping his tablet. "No permit for a library. No fire safety certification for public assembly. And that space heater. That's a code violation." "This isn't a business," Arthur replied, his voice steady. "It's my garage. And these are my guests. Is it a crime now to invite neighbors over to read?" The man in the grey suit stepped forward. He was younger, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Penhaligon, I'm Marcus Thorne, representing Sterling Heights Development. We're the ones revitalizing Miller's Green. We appreciate your passion for the past. But your guests are causing a disturbance. We've had complaints about noise and loitering." "Loitering?" Arthur looked back at the kids. Leo was watching intensely, his hands balled into fists in his pockets. Maya was holding a book like a shield. "They are reading, Mr. Thorne. If you find the sound of pages turning to be a disturbance, I suggest you buy some earplugs." Thorne's smile flickered. "Let's be clear. The City Council is voting to approve the parking garage in 10 days. It's a done deal. This neighborhood needs the tax revenue, not a dusty park or a garage full of old books. Don't make this difficult for yourself. At your age, you should be resting, not fighting the future." "The future," Arthur said, "is sitting right behind me. And they deserve a park more than you deserve a parking spot." The men left, but the next morning, Arthur found a notice of violation taped to his red mailbox. The fines were $500 a day. The fog tried to return that night. Arthur sat alone after the kids left, looking at the orange paper. $500 was more than his monthly pension. He looked at the books. Maybe he should just pack them up. Maybe the city was right. Maybe he was just an old man clinging to ghosts. He was about to turn off the Edison bulbs when he heard a knock on the side door. It was Leo. "I heard them talking today," Leo said, his voice low. "The guys in the suits. They think you're gonna quit because of the money." Leo reached into his hoodie and pulled out a crumpled envelope. He set it on the table. Inside were $5 bills, singles, and a handful of quarters. "The kids. We did a car wash today. And Maya's mom works at the bakery," she put out a jar. "It ain't 500, but we're gonna get more tomorrow." Arthur looked at the pile of change, the hard-earned money of a neighborhood that supposedly had nothing. He felt a lump in his throat that no amount of peppermint tea could soothe. "Leo," Arthur whispered. "You didn't have to do this." "Yeah, we did," Leo said, looking at the 1920 blueprint. "You said history is the soul, right? Well, they're trying to kill the soul of our neighborhood. And you're the only one who showed us where it's buried." Arthur realized then that he wasn't just a librarian anymore. He was a general. And his army was ready. "Keep your money, Leo," Arthur said, pushing the envelope back. "Use it to buy bus passes. We're going to the county records office. All of us. If Sterling Heights thinks they can hide a century-old promise in a pile of digital data, they've never met a group of researchers with nothing to lose." The next week was a blur of action. The Midnight Library became a war room. While Arthur fought the legal fines through a pro bono lawyer he'd taught 30 years ago, the teenagers became record raiders. They spent their afternoons in the basement of the county archives, their young eyes scanning thousands of microfilmed pages that had been ignored for decades. They were looking for the original deed of 1892. They were looking for the handwritten ink of Clara Miller. On the night before the city council vote, the garage was silent. They had searched everything. Their eyes were bloodshot. Their fingers were stained with ink. "I found it," Maya whispered. She was tucked in the corner, hunched over a heavy, leather-bound volume of misfiled miscellaneous deeds, 1890 to 1900. Arthur hurried over. There, tucked between a sale of livestock and a stable lease, was a yellowed piece of parchment. It bore the seal of the city, but it had never been scanned. Arthur read the words, his heart racing. To be held in perpetuity for the recreation and health of the youth of this ward. Should a structure of iron or stone be placed upon this soil for the purpose of commerce, the title shall revert immediately to the residents, and the city shall forfeit all claims. Perpetuity, Arthur breathed. It means forever. "We got 'em," Leo said, a grin breaking across his face. But as they cheered, a loud crack echoed through the garage. A brick shattered the front window, landing right on the 1920 blueprint. Wrapped around the brick was a note. "Get out." Arthur looked at the shattered glass, then at the terrified faces of the children. He realized that Goliath wasn't just using clipboards anymore. They were using fear. Arthur picked up the brick and set it on the table. He looked at his Midnight Librarians. "Get your coats," Arthur said, his voice like iron. "Tomorrow, we don't just read history. We make it." The morning of the city council vote arrived with a sky the color of wet slate. Arthur Penhaligon stood in front of his bathroom mirror, his fingers trembling as he fumbled with the buttons of his best dress shirt, the one he'd worn to Martha's funeral. He felt every one of his 74 years in his bones, a dull ache that seemed to hum in time with the rain tapping against the window. On his bedside table sat the original 1892 deed, tucked inside a protective plastic sleeve. It was just a piece of paper, thin and brittle, yet it felt heavier than a lead weight. When he stepped out onto his porch, he found his army waiting. There were 20 of them, teenagers in hoodies, elderly neighbors with umbrellas, and even a few parents who had heard whispers of the Midnight Librarian. Leo stood at the front, holding a hand-painted sign that read, "History is not for sale." "You ready, Mr. P?" Leo asked. The boy's defiance had turned into something else. Purpose. "I've been ready for 50 years, Leo," Arthur said. "I just didn't know it until now." The city council chamber was a room designed to make ordinary people feel small. High ceilings, polished mahogany, and air so cold it felt clinical. At the front sat the 5 council members, looking bored as they shuffled papers. To the right sat Marcus Thorne and the legal team for Sterling Heights Development, looking like sharks in Italian wool. Arthur and the neighborhood residents took their seats in the back. The room smelled of wet wool and anxiety. "Item 14, the council president announced, his voice echoing. Proposed rezoning of Miller's Green for the Sterling Heights transit and parking structure. We will hear from the developer's representative first." Marcus Thorne stood up, radiating a slick, practiced confidence. He spoke of revenue streams, urban optimization, and forward-facing infrastructure. He showed digital renderings of a gleaming glass and steel garage that looked nothing like the neighborhood it was meant to inhabit. In short, Thorne concluded, Miller's Green is a vacant, unproductive lot. It serves no historical or economic purpose. It is time to move Oak Ridge into the 21st century. "Is there any opposition?" the council president asked, already reaching for his gavel. Arthur stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I am Arthur Penhaligon," he said, walking toward the microphone. His heart was thumping, a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "And I represent the residents of Oak Ridge." Thorne didn't even turn around. He just leaned back and whispered something to his lawyer. "Mr. Penhaligon," the council president sighed. "We've heard your concerns about sentiment before. But this board operates on legal standing and land use policy. Unless you have something new, your time is limited. I have the truth, Arthur said. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the 1892 deed. You claim this land is unproductive. But land isn't a factory, it's a promise. This is the original deed for Miller's Green, signed by Clara Miller. Arthur's voice grew steady, the old teacher's resonance returning to him. He read the restrictive covenant aloud, the words that Maya had found in the dusty archives. He read about the perpetuity of recreation and the reversion of title. The room went silent. The council president peered over his glasses. Mr. Penhaligon, all city records were digitized in 2012. No such covenant exists in the database. That's because your database is a summary, Arthur countered. It's a low-yield asset, to use your own terminology. You relied on digital shadows. I am holding the light. He walked forward and laid the yellowed parchment on the clerk's desk. This deed was misfiled in the miscellaneous books over a century ago. It was never scanned. It was never summarized. But under the law of this state, it is the only document that matters. If you build so much as a brick of that garage on that soil, the city loses the land entirely, and it reverts to the neighborhood trust. Marcus Thorne's lawyer shot up, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his tie. This is an ambush. We have no way of verifying the authenticity of that document in this setting. From the back of the room, Leo stood up. We verified it. We have the microfilm numbers and the witness signatures from the county archive. We did the homework you were too lazy to do. Order, the president shouted, but the room was already erupting. The neighbors were cheering. The council members were whispering frantically to their legal counsel. Arthur stood his ground, his hand resting on the podium. He looked at Thorne, who was staring at the deed as if it were a poisonous snake. You told me that at my age, I should be resting, Arthur said into the microphone. But I've realized something. History doesn't rest. It waits. It waits for someone to care enough to look for it. The council went into an emergency recess that lasted 2 hours. When they returned, they looked pale. Based on the evidence provided by Mr. Penhaligon, the president announced, the legal department has advised that the restrictive covenant is indeed valid and enforceable. The rezoning request for Miller's Green is denied. The roar that went up from the Oak Ridge residence was loud enough to shake the mahogany walls. Leo hugged Arthur so hard the old man nearly lost his balance. Maya was crying. Even the court reporter was smiling. The Midnight Library is no longer in Arthur's garage. Following the victory, a local philanthropist, moved by the story of the teacher and his detectives, donated the funds to renovate the old, closed community center basement. It is now officially named the Penhaligon Heritage Center. It doesn't have digital learning vouchers. It has books. It has maps. And it has a row of wicker baskets by the door for phones. Arthur still wakes up at 6 a.m. He still eats his dry toast. But the fog is gone. His house is no longer silent because every afternoon, he walks down to the center. He is no longer a volunteer. He is the director emeritus. On a warm evening in May, Arthur sat on a new bench in Miller's Green. The park was alive. Kids were playing soccer where a parking garage almost stood. Leo, now a high school senior with a scholarship to study law, sat next to him. You think they'll try again, Mr. P? Leo asked, nodding toward the downtown skyline. Arthur watched the sun set, casting a golden glow over the trees that Clara Miller had intended for them to see. Let them try, Arthur said, a twinkle in his eye. We've taught a new generation how to read the fine print. And once people learn how to find the truth, it's very hard to make them forget it. Arthur leaned back, breathing in the scent of fresh grass and old paper. He realized Martha was right all those years ago. The best stories don't end, they just wait for the next person to turn the page.